All right. Welcome to the Dakotans Measure 4 debate. It's a live stream event. It looks like my audio is cutting out. Sorry about that. Live stream event here that's happening by the Dakotan. First off, thank you for joining us today. We are excited about this. This is obviously a very important issue that's going to be affecting North Dakota for future generations. I will introduce myself first. I'm Jonathan Starr. We host many conversations here at the Dakotan, and we'd invite you to stop by our YouTube channel to listen to those conversations any opportunity you get. Also want to thank the debate participants, both Dr. Rick Becker and attorney Bob Harms, for participating on this. We have two sides representing different perspectives on Measure 4, which will be impacting the property tax issue in North Dakota. On one side, we have in unfair property tax represented by Dr. Rick Becker, and on the other side, we have Keep It Local represented by attorney Bob Harms. Of course, there's many questions that we have on this issue, and so we are very thankful to have Mike Blessum here with us, who is going to be moderating the event to make sure that we can get some clarity on what will happen if this measure passes or if it doesn't. Mike.
It's good to be with you, Jonathan. I think it should be a good discussion tonight. I know that we've had a lot of this discussion going on in the last few weeks. We were talking before we came on with Rick and Bob about how busy they've been even over the last week.
Right.
It's been daily events in different places, and I think that's a great thing.
Absolutely. It's great to hear a conversation happening on this and conversation picking up on these important issues in North Dakota in general. It seems like there's a lot more of those happening, which I think is really important as we consider important discussions that are going to impact us for future generations.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I'm hearing that around town right now. I think we must be coming into the last kind of 5 weeks here of the election cycle because people are really buzzing about it. And I think that's a good thing. There's one thing that our republic requires, and that's a learned public before Absolutely. They vote. And so I'm glad that people are asking questions, they're reaching out and they're talking. That's a good thing.
Very good. Well, appreciate you coming on and doing this, and I'm going to turn over to you and the participants.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Rick and Bob for their service that they're providing to the residents of our state by doing these debates. It's incredibly important, guys, and I appreciate that. Our republic requires informed voters, and I believe these discussions provide one of the best formats for helping people come to their own conclusions. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. So what we're going to do tonight, I have a set of questions that I put together based on my own thoughts on the measure and just, talking to people around the Minot area and friends and colleagues that I have here, and we'll use those to move the debate along. But I'd also like to encourage you to have a conversation. If there's a part of the conversation where it's appropriate to ask each other questions, let's have the talk. Let's do that. So, many debates are a 2-minute, 1-minute rebuttal kind of thing. I'm not looking for exactly that. I'd like it to be free flowing, and we'll see where it leads us, because I think we're going to have a good conversations that way. And that's really, I guess, what I'm hoping for out of this to sort of differentiate us from, the 15 in a row that you guys have done on the other formats. So hopefully that'll work. And so with that, what I think we'll do, we'll start with opening statements. We'll have some closing statements at the end as well, but we'll start with that. And we're going to start with Dr. Rick Becker. You're the one who's the proponent of this, Rick. You're the sponsor of the measure. So we'll give you the opportunity to lead it off and make the case.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for hosting this, and thanks to Bob for coming out and repeatedly being willing to discuss it. It's very important, as you said, for North Dakotans. And I like to clarify that there are so many things that are divisive in society, in politically speaking. This really shouldn't be one of them. What we have are two different sides. And the people that are in favor of the measure want it to pass because they believe it's going to be very, very good for North Dakota. The people opposed are opposed simply because they're concerned about bad effects that they believe are going to happen. So both have the interests of North Dakota at heart. So we shouldn't let this divide us. This measure, in very simple terms, does two things. One, it allows everyone who is paying property tax to keep what they are paying in property tax in their pocket every year going forward. It requires the state to replace that amount to every political subdivision in an amount no less than what they are levying here in the next couple of months, what we are going to pay in taxes in 2025. And it does that with no strings attached because of how it's worded. It does not have the state in the budgets. It doesn't do anything. They just replace a flat amount, no questions asked. That's how we get to keep that money in our pockets. And, I like to ask people, what are you going to do with that money if you don't have to pay your property tax in the amount current? What are you going to do with that year after year after year? I mean, it's amazing what this will do for the economy of North Dakota. The second thing it does, it says, you know what? People really, really dislike property tax for just two or three reasons. Number one, valuations. Valuations really are a thorn in the side to the people because we have very little control over them. We are afraid to even improve our home, at least on the exterior, for fear that we're going to be taxed more. We may live in an area that's developing and our valuations keep climbing, even though nothing has been done to our home, but yet increasing valuations mean we pay more taxes. And it's a stealth tax because no one claims responsibility for it, but yet we pay more in taxes. It's also a tax on unrealized gains, not unlike Kamala Harris's plan for the United States. A tax on unrealized gains is a really, really terrible way to tax. That's what valuation-based property tax is. We also greatly dislike mill levies. No one understands. Very, very few people, including legislators and local elected officials, truly understand how the mill levy system works. How can we as a people defend ourselves, advocate for ourselves, have agency on one of the three major ways in which we are taxed when we don't understand how it actually works? And then the third thing is it's unconscionable that someone could lose their home, something they paid off perhaps years ago. They fall in hard times, 2.5 years of not being able to keep up with property taxes, the government will start foreclosure proceedings and you will lose your property. The idea that you could lose your property because you can't pay that rent, that tax to the government, really begs the question, did you truly own the property ever? So there are many things wrong with this system. This measure, in addition to letting you keep everything you pay in property taxes now in your pocket, transforms how locals will do taxing and moves away from valuations and mill levies to something that is much more fair and transparent and in which people have access to their local elected officials to discuss it. So it doesn't take away funding. It doesn't prevent future funding. There's no reason for a loss of services. Everything is going to be okay. We're moving to a much improved method.
Okay, thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Rick. Again, we also appreciate you guys hosting this, and Rick and I have talked about this a number of times over the last number of weeks, and we're friends. We have different perspectives about this. I'm opposed to this for three reasons. I'm going to get to that in a minute. I want to talk about a couple of things, and I like, Mike, where you were going at the beginning to talk about kind of a philosophy, and what I hope we can accomplish in the next hour, hour and a half, not argue about what the facts are, but have a conversation about the philosophy and the effect so that the people don't get confused about what they heard. They understand the fact case, and then they can make a decision: is this good policy for our state or isn't it? So I like where we're going. Everybody knows there's no Santa Claus, there's no free ride in anything. One of the things that troubles me about this measure is that it displaces responsibility for your property taxes. I want to give you a couple of facts. I want to talk a little bit about what the measure does and does not do, and then get to the reasons why I'm opposed to it. Rick talked about what it does, and he's right. A couple of other things that it does is it removes the provision in the Constitution that allows us to centrally assess pipelines, railroads, utilities, things of that sort. The other thing it does is it removes the funding, the 1 mil funding mechanism for the University of North Dakota Medical School, something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but that's one of the other things that it does. What it does not do is it doesn't have a mechanism for growing the revenue that the local political subdivisions will get after the 2024 amount. So if Tioga levies $450,000 a year, it doesn't mandate how Tioga can or should meet that future revenue needs with new personnel, more medical expenses, health insurance costs, a new police car. It doesn't have a mechanism in the measure as to how that revenue should be replaced as expenses of local governments go up. That's one of the things it doesn't do. It allows for local governments to build new buildings but it doesn't specify as to how that's to be done. That's some of what it doesn't do. I'm a volunteer. I don't represent Keep It Local. These are my words. Nobody's paying me to do this. One of the things, I'm just getting to a couple of facts and then get to the 3 reasons why I'm opposed to it. This really represents a tax shift. This isn't a tax cut. What's happening is the property taxes that we all pay and don't like paying is now going to be paid by the state of North Dakota in some fashion or another. That's one of the things that it does. And our state is heavily dependent on the oil industry. We get more than 50% of the tax revenue today comes from one industry, the oil industry. The last thing I want to say before I get to the 3 reasons why I'm opposed to it is this measure displaces the responsibility for your property tax bill. That means that school boards, county commissioners, city commissioners, park board members, those are the elected officials that drive your property tax bill. Those are the elected officials that set your property tax rate. Not the legislature, not the governor, nobody in Bismarck. The people who set your property tax bill are the ones that you should have voted for in June. Here are the 3 reasons I'm opposed to this measure. Number 1, we're using the Constitution inappropriately, I think, because it will freeze that number, the 2024 funding level. It freezes that number into the Constitution. I'll give you 2 examples. And by the way, it punishes savers and it rewards spenders. I'll just give you for instance. Let's say Tioga levies a $450,000 property tax in 2024, and they're fiscally conservative. They're trying to manage their money well. They're savers. That number, 450,000, gets frozen into the Constitution. Now let's take Stanley, and Stanley's about the same size, but let's say Stanley's attitude is they're spending a lot more money. Their budget is $2 million. So that Tioga's budget of 450,000 goes into the Constitution. Stanley's budget at $2 million goes into the Constitution. Both of those numbers are frozen. The savers are punished, the spenders are rewarded. And then the other thing that the problem that the measure has is there's no mechanism for building on top of that 2024 amount. There's no additor, there's no inflation mechanism built into it. So as the cost of local government goes up, as the years go by, those local jurisdictions will need more money, and the measure doesn't have a mechanism for how that's going to be done. It will require the legislature to fill that gap. That's the first reason, Constitution and the funding inequities that freezes in the Constitution as a result. Second reason, it creates a windfall of about $1 billion every 2 years to large out-of-state companies. Rick and I have been using different numbers, and I was troubled by that. But let me give you 3 numbers, and I think he and I will agree on these. I used to say that 1/3 of the property taxes are paid by homeowners. That's a different number than what he's been using. The number I just got it from the tax commissioner today. The number is 43% of the property taxes paid in North Dakota are paid by homeowners. 43%. I was a little shy on the 1. The other commercial centrally assessed, those together are about 38%. So a little over 1/3. So we collect $3 billion of property taxes every 2 years. About 1/3 of that is paid by these large out-of-state companies, the majority of which are located out of state. Let me give you a couple of examples how significant that is. All the pipeline companies in McKinsey, Williams, Dunn, and Montreal County, those 4 counties, those pipeline companies pay $46 million a year in property taxes. Amarada Hess, or Hess in Williams County, they pay $6 million in property taxes every year. In Montreal County, 47% of the property taxes paid in that county are paid by those kinds of companies. In Williams County, it's 65%. In McKenzie County, it's 85%. 85% of the property taxes paid in McKenzie County are paid by those kinds of companies that are doing business here. One pipeline company pays 19% of the property taxes in McKenzie County. They're not here asking for property tax break. We're going to send them a check. That money leaves North Dakota every 2 years in the amount of $1 billion. That's the second reason. Third reason, North Dakota can't afford it. The property tax bill officially is $3.1 billion. That's how much it will take to replace that money that the local jurisdictions are taxing today. We got to find someplace for $3.1 billion. The general fund and the SIF fund, those are the basic two checking accounts that are available to meet that obligation, are $7 billion. So we have a $7 billion pot to draw from, and we have a $3 billion bill. On top of that $3 billion is a budget gap that the legislature has created. So when they come to Bismarck in January, they start $1 billion in the hole. So really we have a $4 billion budget to meet if this thing passes out of a $7 billion number. I don't think we can find enough surplus, if you will, to meet that. And if we can't, then the legislature is going to have to look for other funding mechanisms or other sources of revenue. I think the most likely will be oil and gas revenues that they already collect. And the easiest one will be the gross production tax. And I just use that. $930 million of that tax goes to cities and counties in North Dakota right now. In my district, in District 2, just the 5 or 6 major communities, Bowbells, Stanley, Crosby, Tioga, Gray, Grenor, just those 5 or 6 communities alone would get $34 million. And I think that's where the legislature will look to try and make up that shortfall, meet that $4 billion amount. I think we can do better by adjusting the tax system that we have. And I have some ideas as to how we would do that legislatively as opposed to blowing up our Constitution with this measure.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Rick, there was a lot of answer there from Bob in his opening statement. Anything that you want to talk about there, or would you like to move on to a question? Oh, we got you muted, Bob. Rick, I think.
I apologize. That was me. I didn't want to be coughing into the microphone. So we can talk a lot about the various things Bob has said. And one thing I'd like to bring up, and it's actually a minor point, but it just kind of sticks in my craw a little bit, this $3.1 billion. You know, that the Legislative Council, the lawyers for the Legislative Council put out a memo in June of this year, just a couple months ago. And we're indicating that was going to be more on the order of 2.5, give or take, billion dollars. The reason we have 3.1, and that's what's going to be on the ballot, you know, that's fine. We can still cover that. It's not going to be that. But unfortunately, a lot of the people that are opposed are much more interested in trying to make it as extreme as possible to scare people. It's all about fear. Because if the measure was really, truly bad on its own merits, you wouldn't need to exaggerate. You wouldn't need to come up with these false apocalyptic scenarios. So they came up with 3.1 billion and differing from the Legislative Council for a couple of reasons. Number one, they included taxes that aren't going to be eliminated, as per the lawyers for the Legislative Council. Number two, they decided to do a percentage increase from 23 to 24. We won't know what the real increase is going to be for about another 6 weeks. So they had to come up with a number. Now, anyone who's reasonable would have said, well, I think probably what's fair is just to take the last 5 years and average it. And the tax commissioner came to the Legislative Council and he gave them 3 options and said, look, we can take the last 5 years average. He said, or you could take the last 2 years average. Those were a little higher because of the inflation that we've had. And then he gave him a third option and said, or we could take the highest year from the last 10 years, which was 10 years ago. And we can say that that's going to be the increase. And even though during legislative committee, they discussed why that number was so high 10 years ago, because of all the new pipelines coming in, the oil activity, and new property being taxed. And they went with that high number. So the number is inflated. Yes, we are going to talk about 3.1 because that's what's on the ballot, but I just want to point out it's not that much. And every step of the way in the opposition's argument is an exaggeration, and it's hyperbole, and it's fear mongering. A couple of other things I just want to point out. Bob said it's 42%. Previously, he was saying, residential is a third. It's a third. That's Association of Counties put that out. I think they are trying to oversimplify it or make it seem like the big evil corporations are paying so much more than they actually are. Residential for ad valorem, non-centrally assessed property is 47%. I've said that before. 20% is agriculture, and 32% plus a few points is commercial. And so, yep, the pipelines total ad valorem centrally assessed, it comes up to only about $88 billion. Pipelines are about $66 million. And so we can address that. We can talk about the pipelines. It's a big deal in Montreal and Williams and McKenzie. But there will be legislation introduced in January to convert the pipelines centrally assessed from ad valorem to in lieu of, so they'll keep paying. Regardless of whether they keep paying or not, though, it's really important to know that no matter whether you have a lot of pipelines in your county, a lot of big businesses, whatever it might be, there are no winners and losers, as Bob was saying, for various counties, depending on what the makeup is, depending on what their spending habit is. There's only winners. The state is replacing in the amount. Every person who lives in that county is keeping what they're paying in property tax. So we are all winners regardless of the county. The opposition tries to pit one against the other. Their motivation is to create this sense of envy so that you say no because someone else might be getting a better deal when we're all getting a fantastic deal because we are all no longer paying property tax.
Okay, thanks, Rick. Bob, anything to add, or should we go to a question?
Well, I want to go back to this 3.1. I don't, this is part of the factual dispute. I don't really want to promote. Frankly, I don't care if it's 2.5 or 2.7 or 2.9 or 3.1. It's a really big number, and we can't afford it. That's whether it's 2.5 or somewhere in the middle between 3.1. I don't really care. It's a huge number that we have to take out of $7 billion on top of the $1 billion hole they start with. And I just don't think it's attainable with the current resources. So I think what will happen is the legislature will look for other revenue sources, and that will be, I think, the easiest source will be oil revenues that they're sending out through cities and counties right now. Rod Backman and I talked with Rick Monday in Williston, and Rod uses this example. Could we do this the first time? Could we find $3 billion the first time? Yeah, he thinks maybe it would be painful, be difficult. He thinks he uses this example. It's like winning the lottery and you have a $100,000 check. You buy a big fancy home. You got the money for the down payment, but you can't afford to pay for the utilities and the property taxes and put furniture in it for the years to come. That's going to be a problem for us, and that's the problem I think that we are setting up for future generations, especially given the fact that our state is so dependent on one industry. Something else that people are talking about is, why don't we use the legacy fund? Well, they use the legacy fund to pay property tax. They're already starting to do that. So let's just double down on that idea. So then when the legacy fund is really needed, it won't be able to do half of it. We're going down a road that just doesn't make sense.
Well, just to be clear, our side has not proposed using the legacy fund. We have proposed using legacy fund earnings.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. I'm not.
Okay, I just want to be clear because a lot of the times the opposition.
You and I agree on that. Yeah.
Right.
A
lot of times the opposition is saying that we are declaring you have to use the legacy fund and it's going to be depleted in 8 years. We haven't said that at all.
Yeah, and I agree with Rick. I've not heard that. I'm really talking about legacy fund earnings, and even that I think is bad policy for its long term. It might feel good for the short term, and we've been doing a lot of that, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, I think, thanks guys. I think that's exactly the kind of conversation back and forth that I was looking for from this. So that's great. So let's do this. Let's go on to one of my first questions here. And so we'll start off with Bob. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that I'd like us to get into is a little bit more of a philosophical discussion around some of these items. And so here's the first one. It's my contention. This is Mike and Mina, just a guy out here, that the only real path to lowering the burdens on North Dakota taxpayers is by electing better leaders that have this as a priority. To me, there's no question about that. Regardless of the outcome of Measure 4, local subdivisions are likely to find a way to get their revenue. Local subdivisions typically rely on 4 main revenue streams to operate: property tax, sales tax, fees for service, and other state and federal transfers. Please give us your thoughts on the relative merits of these means of collecting the dollars to meet the amounts in these local budgets. And Bob, we'll start off with you.
Well, Mike, you really hit the nail on the head. That's been a fundamental problem that I've had with this issue, this idea for 10 years. This idea came up 10, 12 years ago. A fellow by the name of Bob Hale, he and I were friends. He's very conservative. He and I met in Bismarck 12 years ago when he wanted me to join his team. I said, I'm not going to join your team, well, because I think it's bad policy for our state. In fact, I'll probably fight you over it. I'm still fighting about it because I think, to your point, the people that make property tax decisions, school board members, county commissioners, city commissioners, and park board members, those are the people that set your property taxes, not people in Bismarck, not legislators, not the governor. And 80% of us didn't bother to vote for those people in June. And so we're whining about our property taxes, but we think our government is on autopilot and we don't have to pay attention to what the school is building or how much the county is spending on a road grader. And it just, it mystifies us that our property taxes go up. We can look in the mirror for the first place. If you wanted to fix property taxes, you had the opportunity to do that in June. And only 20% of North Dakotans voted in June for the people who set their property tax rate. To your point about local governments raising money, this is something that everybody, and I think Rick and I will agree on this. The legislature will have to convene and authorize local governments for a new means of taxing real estate or sales tax, because some of those local jurisdictions don't. A school board doesn't have the ability to tax property, and it doesn't have a sales tax mechanism. So it will need legislation to do that. They can have some fees. Townships have no means of raising money other than property tax. Some counties have some home rule charters. So those mechanisms you talked about are non-existent in most of local government. Some have some abilities to levy sales. I talked with somebody this afternoon. Take Tioga, for example, my hometown. After they use that $450,000 that they levy, and it starts to get a little thin in 2027 or 2028, they can raise their sales tax. They don't need the legislature to do that. They have the ability to do that themselves. But the park board doesn't have any authority. The school board doesn't have any authority to raise money other than to pay the bonds for the new school edition they approved.
So yeah, I'd like to address the question as well. Of course, first off, you talked philosophically. I mean, you want the people who are receiving services to be paying for the services they receive. You want people with skin in the game to be there. And so, yes, it's the state. We don't want the state picking up the tab. And that's why, if, for instance, what the governor had been saying or other opposition people had been saying were true, that the state is just picking up the tab, writing the check for whatever the locals are doing, that would be very, very bad. But when you look at what this measure does, what I've talked about, all of the future tax increases are still resting with the decision makers on a local level. So they are still determining how much and to where and the method of how that taxing will occur. So that is still taking place on a local level. The state is not involved at all with those decisions. The reason, in part, now there's some apathy everywhere across the nation, and there has been significant apathy for a long, long time. That is a discussion outside, really, of the discussion of this measure. However, one of the reasons that can keep people from really being involved with property tax or their concerns is, again, A, they don't understand it. B, they have very little control over it. Think about how this discussion goes. Number one, there's valuation. Well, you can't really complain about your valuation, and the county or city can't do anything about it either, because the state forces them to be at that 95% sales ratio plus or minus 5%. They have no choice in it. So then they could, well, let's lower mill levies. Well, the state puts them in a box, and if they lower mill levies, they lose some funding for roads, they lose some funding for schools. So with property tax, the locals are in such a tight box. There are so many restrictions. So then they have the meeting where there's this big budget, and they talk about mills again, which no one understands. How are you supposed to advocate for yourself? Bob wants people to be involved. How are you supposed to be involved when you don't even know what the terms mean and you don't know how it works? And I'm not making disparaging remarks to our voters. I'm including legislators and local elected officials. Very few people know how it truly works. I was a legislator from 2013 on. I didn't know how it worked until 2018 when I started researching it. So what we have then is the locals making the decision with this new method that's more transparent, that's more accessible, and is more fair, coming out in public meetings where people can come to the meetings and say, wait a minute, what is this about? You're increasing taxes. Why? Well, we're increasing taxes in your township because gravel's a lot more expensive. We have to. Oh, okay, well, that makes sense. That's a much different conversation than this budget with there's 233 mills and each mill has a value of this and your value and that value, and there's true and full value and assessed value and taxable value. You can't expect people to be engaged when they don't understand and they feel disenfranchised. As to Bob's other main point, yes, the legislature is going to have to do enabling language. He talked about that this shouldn't be in the Constitution. Actually, absolutely must be in the Constitution. In the Constitution is where we have already the section that says that the state cannot levy a valuation-based property tax. So that's the proper place to put, where we have put the state nor any political subdivision may levy a valuation-based property tax. Now, what doesn't belong in the measure are the very thing Bob's talking about, the details for how locals can raise the revenue they need. Because yes, we're taking an arrow out of the quiver, right? Valuation-based property tax, that's what they're most accustomed to. With all its faults, that's the thing that has been going on. We're taking that arrow out of the quiver. So enabling language must be done by the legislature, not time after time after time, just this next session, January through April. It's the normal thing to do with any constitutional measure. Townships, rural fire, rural ambulance. Without doing any enabling language, yes, they would then lose it when this passes, their ability to raise revenue. Why? Because of a simple restriction in the century code. You don't address that in a constitutional measure. You have the framework in the Constitution so that the legislature can change that restrictive language in the century code, and you change 4 words or 5 words or whatever it might be so that you take those handcuffs off. The legislature has already addressed giving more power to locals when they have enacted home rule charter for cities and counties. It's that type of language. It's already there. You can tweak it and you can move it over for all cities and counties, and they will be able to raise the revenue they need, and it won't be valuation based. This is not a super complex problem. It's going to require some extra work, sure. But I mean, it's worth it for the value that we're all going to get, for the economic boom that's going to happen in North Dakota. It's worth the effort for these folks to do a little bit more work.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that, guys.
Mike?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Bob.
Mike, if I could, I think just to maybe put a ribbon around what Rick just said, what he's talking about is the lift that we're expecting the legislature to make. He's saying that we're going to have a bill restore the authority to centrally assess pipelines and railroads. So that's one task that they'll have. Second task is somehow providing means to, whether it's school boards, townships, cities and counties that don't have the authority to have a sales tax or some other mechanism like that. A third thing that they're going to have to work on is I'd probably look at some other measure, some other mechanism for taxing real estate. You know, there's been discussion about square footage. That might be a possibility, or linear feet, how you're going to manage the ag land. So that would be a third part of the task that this measure essentially leaves to the legislature to resolve. And I think that's going to be a big lift.
Okay.
Let him work.
All right. Sounds good. So Rick, we'll go to you for the next question. So in the 2023 session, Doug Burgum proposed a budget of $18.4 billion. The 7-1 Republican supermajority in the legislature had a final budget number of 19.6. So they found a way to go above and beyond the governor's ask with our supermajority and spend more. Our local budget in the city of Minot will be up somewhere around 12 to 13% this year. I serve on the city council now. I'm a part of that process. Fargo will be up 11%. At our core, do we have a problem on the revenue side of the equation in North Dakota, or do we have a spending problem?
Well, we have a spending problem because the revenue is there. If it's very difficult to be fiscally conservative when the money is there. It's really easy to be a staunch conservative fiscally when money is tight. That's why North Dakota seems so conservative in the 80s. And yet we've been a runaway train in these last 15 years since oil money has come in. Our increase in spending in North Dakota over the last 15 years per capita, if you take all of the other states' increase in spending per capita, average it, North Dakota is just about double the average of all of the other states, including Illinois and California and New York and New Jersey. I mean, there are many ways to look at it. I've pointed out, I have a chart where I've shown that before oil money up to 2009, we spent a little less than South Dakota every year. And now magically, we spend over $2 billion per year more than South Dakota every year. I mean, that tells you we have a spending problem. You pointed out that the governor had a budget and the legislature went $1.5 billion over that. Isn't that interesting, right? They can't cut spending. It's all necessary, but somehow we could have gotten by with $1.5 billion less. Now, some of that's federal. Bob probably wants to point that out. But I'll tell you that we, the legislature, spent $2 billion more non-federal money, only state money, $2 billion more than they did 2 years earlier. So I just don't see that you can increase by $2 billion from session to session, non-federal spending, and say we can't cut out of that the money that we need. It's absolutely nuts. We go on and on, but the money is there. The spending is the problem. And you know what? The legislators are well-intentioned. I really go hard at them. And many of them would like to probably to see me move out of state, perhaps. But they're not malicious. Legislators, elected officials, by and large, local and state, believe that they're doing best for their community, for their state. When they do these programs and this big spending, they think they're doing so much, and they just don't understand the most basic concept that we are all better off if we spend the money ourselves. If we keep the money we earn and spend it as we see fit, we are better off. We have the money to make that happen with Measure 4.
Bob?
Well, you've, Rick, I'm sure watched me when he was talking, because I agree with most of what he said about spending, whether it's at the local level or the state level. I mean, everything from the new governor's residence to the Heritage Center addition to the Theodore Roosevelt Library to the hundreds of millions of dollars in new buildings in the university system. But to his point, we have money. And frankly, we have a lot of nice things in North Dakota we didn't have 20 years ago. You go to my hometown of Tioga, beautiful new city hall, a new ambulance department. The roads are marvelous around Western North Dakota. We didn't have those roads in the middle of the Bakken. So yeah, we're spending a ton of money. Some of that, frankly, I'm happy about. But I think, to Rick's point, legislators and everybody's well-intentioned. There aren't many malicious, ill-intentioned elected officials that I've met in the 40 years I've been involved in public policy and politics. But we do kind of lose sight of where we should be from a core fiscal value perspective. So I think, but go back to spending. Measure four. If we have to find $4 billion out of a $7 billion pot, you are going to cut things that are now in place. And we were at an event last night in Tioga, and I made the point. If you start cutting programs and things that people already have expectations for, whether it's some road project or something they're getting at the local nursing home, those are going to have impacts. And it's not going to be a simple matter of just taking the number and slicing it in half. You're going to have real impacts to the local governments, to things like school boards or school systems, and you name it, statewide, whether it's the university system or otherwise. But do we get there? Maybe once. It's going to be really painful. I don't think you can find $4 billion in that $7 billion without upsetting the entire apple cart, to be honest.
Well, it's more than seven. I mean, there's going to be a lot more than $1 billion in the SIF fund. And
that's the number they have right now. I mean, you and I have to agree. The latest forecast, the number is 7.1 billion. That's what they have available.
Well, at the moment, but there's a lot of money that's already spoken for. And the other thing about SIF is, as you know, the buckets, the legislature created buckets and buckets and buckets where the oil money flows into one, and when that's full, it flows into another and another and another. Well, we know that all of those buckets are going to fill, and they're going to fill very soon. And that leaves one bucket left, the SIF fund. Now, the federal government is projecting oil to be 30% higher than what the legislature forecasted it to be during session. And so that extra money, which is going to be tremendous, will keep flowing and filling up the SIF fund. So that's significant. But again, I hate getting bogged down in the funds. It's not about the funds. It's about how much we've been spending and our increases. And there is absolutely no way to justify the increases. When I'll point to South Dakota again, we used to be year after year after year spending the same. Now, year after year after year, we're spending over $2 billion per year more. Why? What is necessary in that $2 billion more than South Dakota that we didn't used to spend? What is necessary? Because we only need $1.25 or maybe even $1.5 billion out of that $2.25 billion more than South Dakota. What are we doing that we can't pull that back?
Mike, I'd like to go back to your philosophical question, because Rick and I probably are in agreement philosophically on this. But and I've listened to his floor speeches for a decade, and he's passionate about saying just what he said. The problem, and it goes back to your question, Mike, about electing leaders. That message that Rick just gave is the same one that he gave on the House floor many times, but the legislature as a body made the policy decision to spend that money for things that they felt served their constituents, served the state and the greater good. I'll give you an example. There's a sheet that Rick's group has put together, the $700 million of corporate welfare that they like to talk about. One is $125 million contribution or gift, if you will, to a company to build a fertilizer plant in over by the Jamestown. Do I think that's good policy that we give private money to private companies? No. But it's designed to diversify our economy and build an economy that isn't dependent to the tune of 55% of its revenue on one industry. My point is, yeah, we have a spending issue, but those spending decisions have been made by our elected officials, by legislators who made the decision that that was a good policy decision for the people of North Dakota.
Well, and I agree with that. That's what the legislators decided. And that's really maybe what this bill comes down to, is the people that are voting yes on this are saying, instead of spending $125 given to a private company, apply that $125 million to property tax replacement. So I get to keep that in my pocket and spend it. The 125 million, so just to double down on how bad this policy is, your legislature chose to phrase this grant. It's technically a loan, but it's forgiven the very day that construction of the plant is finished. So it's a grant. They chose to tie it to a certain way to create the fertilizer, hydrolysis of water. And so it's a very inefficient way. There's almost no companies that do it except for the one that this was intended to be a gift for, a wind energy company. So this is a complete misallocation, a very poor way to use taxpayer dollars. And they've done this. And we can say, well, listen, then you got to hire new legislators. You got to elect new people. And yeah, that's correct. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to tell the legislature, look, this is what we want. You are now, instead of building $400 million in new school buildings on campuses where they should actually be shuttering buildings because school enrollment in colleges has declined 13 years in a row, instead of giving $95 million to a nonprofit to hand out to other businesses at will, instead of paying $2 million to private companies to hire foreigners, instead of paying $3 million to a private company to try and revive the woolly mammoth, maybe instead of those things, you can then do the job that we wanted you to do and be a good steward of our taxpayer dollars, allow us to keep this money that you are frivolously spending, so we can do better for ourselves, our family, and the state.
And Mike, so then in the giveaways, I go back to the second reason I'm opposed to this thing. The bigger giveaway is the giveaway to centrally assessed and commercial properties, the majority of which are from out of state. I'm looking at a tax statement. Every county in the state, I'm looking at the top 3 taxpayers. Burke County, wind farm, $1 million, just shy of $1 million. They'll get a check from the people of North Dakota for $933,000 every year. That's a giveaway. And we don't need to do that and fix our property tax system that most of us agree with needs some revision. When the state got into this, giving money for property taxes, I argued against that. It was something that Governor Hoeven proposed back in 2009, I think it was, maybe 11, I forget when it was. So we're going to have the state of North Dakota pay spending decisions made by city council members, county commissioners, school board members. We're going down that road, and we've been down that road for over a decade. We've spent $7 billion. We've had some reform, but modest. At least now you can look at your property tax bill and you can see which taxing jurisdiction actually increased your property tax bill and which didn't, and how much the legislature has contributed towards keeping your property tax bill less than it is. But that's the big giveaway in this deal is the companies that aren't asking for it and that we're overshooting the mark.
So I'll argue with that. That's not the big giveaway. That's the boogeyman that the opposition wants to create to try and prevent us from doing good for ourselves,
you're gonna give it away,
and our loved ones, and our children, and our grandchildren, and our neighbors, and our friends. We're supposed to be, Bob and the opposition wants us to say, no, we don't want that benefit because corporations are going to also get a benefit. But it's very obvious the corporations are the ones getting the benefit now. They get the benefit now. This will make sure that we all get the benefit. The other thing is Bob talks about the commercial real estate, which is, again, 32% of all property taxes. And he points out from probably, I think, Association of Counties, They found this great metric to say, okay, the top 3 taxpayers of every county, 82% are out of state or something like that. Sure, of course, the big boys are going to be out of state. These huge multinational corporations happen to own big property. That's true. But do you know who else is in the commercial? The guy who owns the little building on Main Street. That's who else. And you know who else benefits when these landlords no longer pay property tax? The small mom and pop businesses that are leasing space from them. So yes, we can create this sense of like, oh, don't let the big bad guys get any benefits. Say no to benefits for yourself and your family because we don't want the bad guy to also get benefit. Again, the bad guys, these people that are being propped up as bad guys are already getting breaks, and they're already getting the corporate welfare and the handouts of taxpayer dollars session after session after session. So we convert to this. Yes, they get a benefit, but it takes away benefit on the backside. And we know, just like we all have skin in the game, the future increases that the locals will need to do, those big bad corporations are also going to have to pay their fair share.
One of the things that Rick and I agree on, Mike, is the handouts that we've been involved with in the last decade to some of those companies that we just talked about, these tax abatements, but they're made by local governments. Take for example Menards in Williston, or maybe it was Minot, or Walmart in Mandan. We give companies like that tax abatement, and so the rest of us pay property taxes that they don't have to. That's part of what we think should be fixed. To continue to do that, maybe that made sense for us when our economy needed every potential lift and catalyst that we could imagine. We don't need that anymore. We should stop doing that. That would be one of the other things that, frankly, I think we should fix, as opposed to this huge unknown constitutional measure that we're talking about here this evening.
I was going to just bring up a little sidebar issue tagging on what Bob was saying earlier about the companies like the pipelines and stuff getting a break. Again, I want to reiterate that there will be legislation, so they'll still be paying. So that's kind of going to be a moot point. But what's interesting with these centrally assessed properties is, well, yeah, you're right. We don't know what the legislature is going to do, but as well as I know, that the legislature is extremely likely to pass legislation that will help lower the replacement cost. When they require centrally assessed to continue paying taxes, that lowers the replacement cost. That's why they're going to do it. But what I wanted to bring out is, again, this really rotten nature of valuation-based property taxes and how it affects people, and in particular for centrally assessed. The railroads petitioned the state to lower the value of all the railroad property, and the value was decreased. The same thing went with wind farms. Petitioned the government, the state government, and said, hey, we want our values decreased. So they decreased the wind farm values. Now, most of our values went up, whether it's commercial or residential. What happens when you have these centrally assessed petitioning the government and allowing their values to go down, you have to pick up that difference. Even if in Burleigh County, in fact, they did not increase their budget, but we got increased taxes. And the reason is because we had to pick up the slack, because the valuations went down for wind, the valuations went down for railroad, and because of how agriculture land is production value, and you do a 10-year average, they wiped out a couple of very bumper crop years, and so agriculture land values went down too. So it's crazy to me that residences, people's homes, they have to pay more tax because the wind farms and railroads were able to talk the state government into lowering their values. That's just not the way to do things.
Yeah, well, you can fix that. The Board of Equalization made those decisions.
Yeah, we can fix it with Measure 4.
Yeah, because, by the way, Mike, we should talk about Measure 2 while we're talking about Measure 4, because that's the double whammy.
Bob, that's a good point. That's a little preview of what's to come. I do have that as a final question, so you guys can have that in mind.
All right, great.
So let's go to this, and Bob, you'll start on this one. So switching gears a little bit, 9 states right now nationwide do not have a state income tax. 5 also do not have a statewide sales tax. Elimination of the property tax has never been implemented at the statewide level in the United States. We know that the income tax-free states are attractive for many reasons. What do you believe would be the economic impact to everyday North Dakotans from the elimination of the property tax?
Well, I think it's uncertain. Nobody's ever done this. We don't have a model that we can point to where we have this huge tax shift that we're talking about here this evening. One of my key concerns would be that ag land is going to be very attractive to out-of-state investors. Commercial property, if the three of us are multimillionaires living in Denver and we're in the commercial property business, and we know that North Dakota doesn't have real estate taxes, I think we'll come into North Dakota and go shopping. So I think that will make commercial property, ag land, and frankly homes more expensive for North Dakota people who live here. I've always been troubled by these notions, these policies that are supposed to attract people from outside of North Dakota. I think we should have policies that benefit North Dakota people. And I think this policy puts North Dakota people at risk from outside investors who will see us as a tax haven for their investment dollar. I think that's one of the concerns I have. Will we get an economic lift? Yeah, there will be some economic lift by having that $3 billion or the $2 billion that'll stay in North Dakota. The other billion is going to be an economic loss because that $1 billion is going to go to New York City and to Houston and Dallas and Denver and out of the states. So it's going to be a mixed bag. But on the whole, I'm not sure what kind of benefits there's going to be. I'm more concerned about the negatives than the positive. I think it's just an unknown. It's guesswork.
Well, I think that there will be, I mean, I think it's hard to conceive of a scenario in which there is an economic benefit. When you leave $1 to $1.5 billion, well, let's say $1 billion because of the bad guys not spending their money in North Dakota. But when you leave $1 billion in the taxpayers' pockets to spend in the state, that alone is going to create a significant economic benefit. Not only that, but we know that property tax abatements have been used to try and lure businesses for many years now. And every legislator who is currently opposed to this measure has been in favor of those. Yet they are now telling us that, well, gosh, if you give this benefit to everyone, and not just in Fargo and Bismarck, but also in every small town throughout the entire state, which is pretty significant, that's not going to draw businesses. I mean, obviously, those two things are incongruent. So it's going to be a huge draw for other businesses. The legislature has been trying to do economic development. Every state is really trying to do economic diversification, I should say, economic diversification. This is the way to do that. This is the way to bring those businesses in. And then we also are worried about workforce development. This is a way to bring young families in because they may be living in an apartment, can't afford their house in wherever they're living. They come here, the cost to buy a house is lower because they don't have that mortgage. I'm sorry, they don't have that property tax in their escrow. They can apply that $200 per month to the actual mortgage. Bob mentioned about, well, housing will probably go up. It won't go up because it'll go up if there is an increased need for which demand is not there. And if there's an increased need, people will buy more houses, which is why every realtor should be in favor of this. And every person in the construction trade should be in favor of this because this will create a building boom as well.
Mike, there's two other concerns that I would have, and that is if you're a non-property owner, a renter, and the legislature does authorize some new sales tax, some new property tax mechanisms, what I think is going to happen is you're going to see a tax shift from property owners people who own property, and their taxes going down to people who don't own property, people who pay sales tax, people who live in apartments. The other concern I have is if, let's say the legislature crafts a new mechanism for taxing real estate, the square footage. And Rick and I both have a 2,000 square foot house. His is worth $100,000 and mine is worth $500,000. And if they tax it on a square footage basis, the expensive home, I think you're going to see that property tax bill go down, and the less expensive home, same square footage, that property tax bill go up. Those are some of the concerns that I have. And we're speculating now, but your question asked us for our opinions, so those are some of my opinions.
Okay. All right, Rick. So the next one will be for you. So I was recently elected to the Minot City Council, as I mentioned. We're completing our 2025 budget cycle actually Monday night. Let's assume for a moment that Measure 4 passes and ad valorem property taxes are outlawed in the state of North Dakota. Give us a picture of what the new world will look like for local subdivisions like ours with the new constitutional language in place.
Okay, so let me preface by saying that I have ideas on it, and my ideas might not be the best. There are a whole slew of elected officials like yourself who may have better ideas or a combination of ideas. One of the nice things about the measure when it passes is that we no longer are going to do local taxing, local revenue generation as a one size fits all. Everyone, regardless of the size of town, east, west, urban, rural, has the same method of taxing, the same limitations, the same restrictions. I was just in Harvey last night. The lady that's in charge of the ambulance there is really worried because they are maxed out at their mills, and if they need to increase their budget, they can't. They're limited. So here's how I look at it. We should be looking at paying for the services we receive. That's how we are able to best be involved as citizens. We know what we're getting, we know what we're paying, and we can engage our local elected officials. So a couple of things I would look at. Number one, I would break what we get down from the city or county down into a couple of things. Number one, we get general government administration, public health, fire, law enforcement. I would just call that municipal operations. And so we would apply a fee. And again, the city or county is getting everything they currently are receiving. They're going to get that from the state. So what they are going to levy to the people is just that little bit of an increase of what they need in their budget. But I would levy a municipal operations fee for those things, and you divide it out according to every resident and according to every business, commercial property or what have you. So do we call that a property tax? I don't know, but it's going out to addresses, because that's really the only way to talk about how we are involved in our community is based on, do you live here, do you work here, what have you. So a municipal operations fee, and that could be put out with a monthly water bill from the city. And what is that? Maybe that's $5 a month, maybe it's $10 a month that gets added on and listed out. The second thing I would look at would be another category that the city provides, and that would be infrastructure maintenance, whether it's snow removal and sidewalk repair, whatever it might be, that type of thing. And there again, I would then say, here's the infrastructure maintenance fee. One method of doing it is to say every parcel, every lot has a flat rate. And then there is also a variable for how much road frontage you have, because that would be a good way of being most fair, and apply that. And then that would be your second line on the monthly water bill, pertinent to future local needs. And maybe that would be another $7 a month or $5 a month.
Okay, Bob?
Well, Mike, you touched on the fundamental premise of your question. Excuse me, the fundamental answer that Rick provided. The beginning of his answer gets to the heart of this deal, and that is we should pay for the services we receive. That's the fundamental part of the problem, is that this measure takes that responsibility away from us. We get a freebie up until 2024. Everything up to 2024, all those spending decisions for the services that we receive, whether it's the Tioga Public School, the Fargo City Commission, Burleigh County, all those services that have been provided to that point at 2024, they're going to be paid by the state of North Dakota. That's a fundamental part of the philosophical part of the problem that I have with this measure. I've had that problem since 10, 12 years ago when it first popped up. But let me answer your question about what I think the future will look like for local government. And I agree with the basic framework. What Rick is describing is that local governments, most will have to have some kind of legislative authorization, whether it's for a sales tax or some kind of mechanism for fees. The problem that I don't like about sales taxes and fees is that they are the most regressive taxing or fee system available. So a $10 fee on my water bill has a different effect on somebody. Rick and I probably won't notice it, but the guy that's working at the local tire store, people with lower incomes, that's going to hurt them more. So it's a regressive tax if it comes down to sales taxes or fees. And then the other thing that is likely to have to be developed is a new system for taxing property. It kind of goes to the fundamental issue, this valuation thing. Rick and I are in agreement that the valuation system that we've talked about is frustrating. I think that it's not that complicated. If your property value goes up by 15%, doesn't mean your house has to go or your property tax bill has to go up by 15%. Put that responsibility back where it belongs. But my point is that the world looks like some kind of additional property tax mechanism will have to be developed by the legislature on a square footage basis, a linear feet, how they do ag land, all of that. Because one of the other things that the measure does is it eliminates the current system for taxing ag land. Ag land has a very, I think, very effective, very efficient formula for taxing farmland right now. They go through production, expenses, value of the commodity, and I think farmers are, for the most part, pretty comfortable with that. But that system is eliminated, and so we're going to have to go back to a new system. What it looks like, I don't know.
Okay, thanks, gentlemen. Okay, so and Bob, you hit on this one a little bit. So one of the places where I think there is some agreement is around this idea of the valuation and assessment process. I think, you know, as I've become a city council member, sitting down with our city assessor and starting to understand that process better than I did before, and you know, we go through our budget process. Our original budget actually held the line on the dollars in our budget with the city. Because of that, our mill rate went down. So we went from 119 mills down to 115. Imagine that, because that doesn't always happen.
Yeah, it's doable, isn't it?
It's possible.
Yeah.
But then you know what happened, Bob, because this is the way evaluation works. I got my preliminary bill in the mail, and of course I was on the reevaluate list. And so my number went up, even though I had done my job as a council member. We're holding the line. We're doing the things the right way. But I got hit. And so I think, again, and that's fine. You know, I'm along the same lines that you're talking about, Bob. I can deal with that. You know who can't? My 26-year-old daughter, my 24-year-old son, both of whom own their first home. And that is where that actually starts to get very real very quickly. And so I guess what I'd like to understand from both of you, and I think we'll start with Bob again here, is how do we get there then? You know, Bob, you've been on this side of it saying, hey, Measure 4 isn't the right way. The legislature's had 12 years to do all of this, and they haven't chosen to. And so I think the question now becomes, how do we actually do something about that?
Well, I think let's talk two things. Substance of the solution and process. Substantively, I've advocated that we do several things. One, that we review and eliminate most, if not all, exemptions, like the Menards property tax rebate I mentioned earlier. That's number one. Number two, that we revise or repeal the valuation problem that we've talked about. If we don't do that at a minimum, then we should have a cap on the growth of property tax revenue from a local political subdivision, I don't care if it's 1.5%, 2%, pick a number. Rate of inflation, I don't care. But I think you put that cap in, and if the local citizenry or the local elected board want more than that cap, they have to vote for it. They can vote for it, but then we at least know the public has expressed its support for that higher level, or the elected officials who want more than that number. We know who the spenders are, and they have to justify why they ask for more than that. And the other thing that I think should do is we should maybe reevaluate this losing your house business. But remember, when somebody else doesn't pay their property taxes for whatever reason, somebody else is paying their share. So we have to keep that in mind. Now, the process, how do we do that? I agree. I mean, we've been at this for 10 years, and we've, I think, been taking the wrong approach. We've been throwing money at it, and I think we should stop doing that. I think we should stop paying local spending decisions with state general fund money. I think it's a bad policy because we've been doing it for so long, and we haven't fixed the problem. Problem is still here, And so the process that I think we should follow is stop doing that. And then I think recognize, and I think Rick and the folks that support this get high credit for this, because you had 40,000 people sign this petition. It tells the legislators that this is a real issue. I think after the vote, let's come together, let's form a coalition, settle on 2-3 property tax reform bills, go in and get it passed. That would be my suggestion. And let me offer one other thing, and Rick has heard this before too. The legislature that exists in January of 2025 is almost entirely new people than the legislature that has been looking at this for the last 3, 4, 5 sessions prior to that. We had 40 new legislators that came into office in the last election. We'll probably get some new legislators this cycle. But the legislative body is almost entirely new. There might be 10% of the legislators that have been there for the last decade that have heard these conversations. But I think after the vote, let's get together and decide what bills we want to pass and go in and get them done.
Yeah, so I want to address one thing from earlier real quick. So the comment about the people who are receiving the services should pay for them. One of the most important things is the reason you want that is because you want the decisions to be made based on that dynamic. So when all of the future increases are being paid by the people who receive the services, that decision-making process, the evaluation of the risks and benefits is all in place. Again, Mike, if we're talking philosophically. Now, we could have done a measure to do just that. And perhaps I think that we'd get a lot less pushback from Bob. I don't know that we'd get any less pushback from some of the other opposition, but that's a big change. And it's difficult. It's much easier to make that change, these great scary unknowns of converting from valuation-based tax to service-based tax. It's easier to do it when it's a little tiny increment. So when we look at this, for instance, Michigan is looking at getting rid of property tax, but they're going to increase sales tax. We have the opportunity to say, listen, on top of the things we hate about property tax, we also know that our state government has a huge spending problem. So let's go ahead and force them to give us the relief that they promised for the last 12 years and we haven't seen. So that's why that's there. But going forward, I don't want people to think, actually, I don't want them to do a Groundhog Day or 51st Dates kind of situation. We already saw this movie in 2012. We were told that if you just vote no, trust us, we've heard you. I think there were about 40,000 voters that voted for Measure 2 back in 2012. And what happened is we had 20 reform bills that failed between 2013 and 2023. Yes, a lot of legislators turned over during this time, but we just had major reform bills last year get killed in the legislature. So these folks still are not interested. We had bills to freeze property tax for seniors and the disabled. We had bills to eliminate property tax on primary residence. We had bills to freeze valuations. We had bills to freeze property tax. We had bills to cap spending increases on locals. Everything failed. Senator Doug Larson, who is a friend of mine, he and I spoke prior to this last session about property tax, and he wanted to give it a go and reform it. And he brought up a bill in the Senate, and he told his fellow senators, he told them, listen, guys, we must do major reform or there will be an initiated measure. Even in the face of that, they voted it down. So don't be fooled. Don't think that if we vote no, the legislature is going to fix things. They won't. They don't have the gumption. We got fooled in 2012, right? That's on them. But if we get fooled now again this year, that's on us. And we should never complain about property tax ever again. I hope instead we are going to have a whole new frontier, a more fair and transparent way of doing local taxing, and we're all going to get big relief by no longer having to pay what we currently pay in property taxes.
Okay, thanks. Jonathan, can you pull us over to that? Let's do just a quick kind of lightning round with some of the stuff that's come in from the viewers, because we've got a lot of people commenting and there's been a lot of good response here. So, so let's see. So one we've got a viewer that asks, how much will homeowners save themselves in property taxes? And Rick, maybe I'll have you answer that because it's kind of your side of this. And also along with that, and we'll just group another piece in there, talk about the outstanding bonds. Minot in particular, we have our big school bond that we just passed 2 years ago that's going to be there for 25 years. So can you answer that one? What a homeowner would see if it passed and what those bonds look like?
Yeah, so whatever you see in your property tax statement, let me say it differently. You will save what you are currently paying in your property tax statement minus special assessments. So the special assessments weren't included in this most recent estimate of taxes. But when you get the final invoice or bill, you will see that special assessments on there. This measure does not take care of special assessments. We don't want people to think that it does. People dislike special assessments as well, but this is not the magic bullet for all of our problems. The other thing is it does not, as Mike alluded to, if you live in a place that has done bonding obligated to property taxes, that stays in place. You will continue paying that small amount of property tax. On a statewide level, it's very small. Minot, it might be a little bit larger, but whatever portion of your property taxes are obligated to a bond, you will need to pay those until the bond is paid off. And because we looked at that, I discussed it extensively with legislative counsel. That's a contract between a city and bondholders. And to say that you would no longer need to pay that would have thrown the entire measure into question. Does that answer it, Mike?
Yep.
So everything that you currently have in property taxes, except you'll still pay special assessments and the small amount of property tax going to bonding.
Yeah, no, I think that hits it, Rick. Thank you for that. Let's see here. We hit, I'm just looking through them here. We hit what the out-of-state property owners would look like. One of the ones that I think has been hit on a lot of the different discussions, but you guys could maybe address it real briefly here. There's always this discussion around how we fund schools and whether property tax should be a part of that equation or not under the Constitution itself. I have this discussion, it seems like weekly right now, because there's a faction of people that believe the Constitution reads it that way, that the legislature should be doing it in the first place. Until we have the Supreme Court coming down on that, I think that's up in the air. And so can you guys comment on that a little bit about how school funding should be happening and whether property taxes should be a part of that?
I guess I can go first. So I think when we say should be happening, philosophically, that would be an interesting discussion. Should the state be funding K-12 education? But I think our discussion should be based on the North Dakota State Constitution. Are we or are we not obligated to have the state fund K-12 education? The way I read the Constitution, I believe we are, but it's not on its face. You can read a little bit of maybe gray area into it, which is why I think we've gotten to where we have. I do think that it would be better based on the Constitution if we did have the state fully pay for K-12 education. What's interesting is if we do have legislators that do have some gumption, when this passes, right at the moment that this passes, the state will have been picking up 100% of K-12. Right now, we're already picking up 80%. We went from 25 to 50 to 75 to 80. We're picking up more all the time. We can cover that last 20%, which really is 40% of whatever the future increases would be for your city and county, which would, again, save you more money. I think they should do that. Whether they do it or not, I don't know. But yes, short answer, I believe we do have that obligation according to our state constitution.
Bob, anything to add to that one?
No, I really don't have anything to add. I think Rick has captured it. I would disagree with the direction of the policy because I think when the state funds 100% of education, I'm concerned about what skin in the game do local school boards have? What restraint do they have for their spending decisions? They're just going to continue to send their bill to Bismarck. That's a problem. I want to go back for just a second, though, and speak to the legislature and the idea that they're incapable of fixing it. The legislature, I've been involved in every legislative session since 1993. And the legislature is dynamic. There are personalities that come and go. But one of the things that the legislature does reflect, and that is the public's will. It's an expression of what it wants, whether it's better roads or changes in how we're managing the oil industry or how our property tax system is managed. So this notion that, they couldn't fix it, they refused to fix it for 10 years, so don't expect anything in the coming session. But if this thing passes, they'll do all these wonderful things for you. They'll restore pipeline taxation, and they'll give every local jurisdiction the taxing authority that they need to have, and we'll construct a new property. I believe that the legislature has the ability and will have the message from the public that this is an important issue that needs to be addressed, and they will address it.
So I want to just respond to that. What we have is 12 years of experience over and over and over where they said no to reforms. There's nothing, when we look back, what evidence is there to think that it's likely they're going to pass it based on history? Zero. There's none. And I want to reiterate, I am not suggesting for 1 second that they're going to do pass the necessary implementing language Bob referred to, like with the centrally assessed pipelines in the townships and all. I don't think they're going to do, because it's all these wonderful things. Remember, I'm getting down to the very base nature of our legislature, and that is they want to be able to spend as much money as they can in the way that they want to spend it. The reason they're going to pass the centrally assessed will still pay taxes is because they don't have to cover that $100 million then. They don't have to replace that. The reason they're going to take the handcuffs off of the townships and the rural fire and the rural ambulance is because they don't want that responsibility. So it's not because they're kind and wonderful and generous. It's because they have a pattern which is easily recognizable, and it's year after year after year. That pattern will continue. That's what we're basing it on, knowing they're going to pass the necessary implementing language to take the handcuffs off of the locals so they can raise the revenue they need.
The 12 years of history that Rick refers to, I haven't looked at this, but I will. I'm going to look back at all of the legislators that are no longer there in the last, up until the last couple of sessions. And I will bet that 75% of the legislators that were there 10 years ago are gone.
Some of the best reforms were last year, Bob. So take a look at how many legislators are gone from last year.
Yeah, well, they didn't have a 40,000 person signature petition in front of them either. So that's an expression of the public's interest in change.
Okay, so just a couple, hopefully really quick hits here. If Measure 4 passes, is it amendable by the state legislature? Yep. And then the last one here of this said, how long does it take to complete and apply an amendment? So I assume they're saying what's the implementation look like? And Rick, I know that's set right in there. So how does that look once it passes?
You know, I wonder, Mike, are they getting, when they asked about the amendment and then how long does it take to have an amendment?
That was two different people, Rick, just to let you know. So I think it was two separate ideas. The first one was, can the state legislature actually change it? That's the way I read it.
Right.
And I think the answer there is no. The legislature could do a new measure that they pushed forward to replace it or do something different. But that's the mechanism there. And then the second one is...
Right. The legislature in 2025 could pass a constitutional initiative, a constitutional measure to put a measure on the ballot for the people to vote on at the very next general election. Yep. That would be as soon as it could happen, which is really soon. But yeah, so some people feel like, okay, and it's not easy to change back, but it's not as difficult as the doomsayers would have you believe. If this turned out to be a horrible idea, or if our economy was suffering because of this, the legislature could have it back on the next general election whenever that occurred.
Sure. And then just implementation wise, can you give just a little bit of the timeline of what happens if the measure does pass and what those dates look like?
Yes. So that's a very good point. I'm glad they asked. This takes effect January of 2025, but I want to be really clear. What it affects is the levying of a property tax. So we are going to get our 2024 property tax levy in about 6 weeks or so. We pay that in 2025. So that's still going to happen. You will still pay your taxes in January or February, March, if you want the 5% discount of 2025. And that money is going to fund your locals for their 2025 budget. What would have been levied in 2025, which won't when this passes, because that's when it takes effect, is what the locals would have gotten in 2026 for their 2026 budget. So that's why we have an abundant time for the legislature and the locals to get everything in order. It's over a year to get things in order.
So Rick, just as a follow-up on that, to be clear, because there's a couple different scenarios that are out there. The first is for those that escrow. So for those that escrow, if their banks are working quickly, they understand what's going on. Starting in January, those house payments should change immediately in January 2025 because they're building towards the 2026 payment. Is that the right way to think of it in your mind?
Yes. Yep. That would be the case. In fact, I would call your bank to say, hey, don't escrow my mortgage anymore. Don't escrow my property tax anymore.
And then for those that write a check, the first check that they wouldn't pay would be the check in the first part of 2026. That would be the first one that is correct. Be paid. Correct. Okay.
That is correct. The measure says it takes effect January of 2025, but practically and functionally speaking, for all of us, it's truly January of 2026.
Great. Okay, well, guys, I promised you one final question, and thanks for sticking with us. We're coming up on the 90-minute mark here, so we appreciate it so much. Hopefully this went well for you, had a little different feel maybe than the others where you got a little more longer format, which was maybe helpful. But let's talk about our bonus question now. So this whole thing comes around the measure process, and the legislature during the 2023 session, it was actually a Senate resolution that was brought forward, would actually change the Constitution, and it's called Measure 2, and it's going to be on the ballot in November. I don't think there's anyone that doubts the sincerity and effort of the countless volunteers, Rick, that you and your team had working on this. They put their hearts and souls to this. I know many of them. Mine was kind of central for a lot of this, and I have a lot of friends that worked very hard on that. The legislature placed that on the ballot to give North Dakotans the options, in my opinion, to make it much more difficult to get measures on the ballot and get them approved. In this case, I think there's changes to who can be on the committee. First of all, there's changes to who can circulate petitions. And I think most importantly, it's got to go through 2 public votes to get passed. And, if I'm wrong on those, please correct it. But those are major changes. So I guess the question is, first of all, what are your opinions on that? And really the underlying question is it too easy today to change our Constitution? And because I think that's really what the Senate sponsors and really, it was crazy to me. The legislature was nearly unanimous. There was 1 no vote in the Senate, and I think it was something like 83-10 or something like that in the House. So the legislature felt strongly, and I'd love your opinions on it.
You want me to go first, Bob? All right. Well, yeah, I'll go. So arguably it may be too easy to change our Constitution. Has been my opinion. But I think that what you'd want to do is look, if you're going to make it harder, you may want to increase the vote threshold to go, say, from 50% to 55%, or something like that. You could see that if you want to make it a little more difficult to change the Constitution. What Measure 2 does, and just to be very clear, I think it's a terrible, terrible measure, and I think we should vote no on it. It makes it much harder, not for the legislature, right? They can still, what I talked about before, if they wanted to put property tax back on, they could, boom, it goes back on, and this doesn't apply. It applies to initiated measures. But it requires 5% of the population for signatures instead of the 4% we have now. And it requires you to go through 2 elections. Now, here's the thing. For grassroots, because this measure was grassroots, there are very, very few constitutional measures that have gotten on the ballot grassroots because it's so hard to do. So hard to do. So now you're increasing it by 25% from 4% to 5% of the total population for signatures. That's going to make it it took us a year to get the signatures. That's going to make it so hard for your basic grassroots to get that extra 1% of the population, 25% more signatures. So grassroots almost takes them out of the game. How about the ultra wealthy, the big out-of-state interests? They can get the 4% in 3 months. All you got to do is pay them $450,000 or $470,000. So when you increase it to 5%, okay, it takes them 4 months instead of 3, and it costs $525,000. No big deal for them. So you've taken the grassroots out, the people of North Dakota out of the game, but you've let the big fat cats in. The other thing is 2 elections. Take a look at what's going on right now. You've got some grassroots people that are fighting for this, and you have and North Dakota Farm Bureau. I wanted to give a shout out to North Dakota Farm Bureau for having the spine to stand up for this measure, which is so good for the people of North Dakota, when every other lobbying organization has pulled their club together and come out in opposition. When you have regular people that are fighting for something, and it takes everything they have to get through an election, and you make them do it twice, we don't have the resources to do that. But you know who does? Super ultra wealthy people and big out-of-state interests. So if Measure 2 passes, you've taken the initiated measure process out of the hands of North Dakotans and you put it in the hands of big corporations. I would much rather we actually have no initiated process whatsoever than to have Measure 2 pass, because the initiated measure is for the people. Measure 2 gives it away, takes it away from the people.
And Bob?
Well, Mike, 2 short answers to that question. Yes, it is too easy to amend our Constitution, and Measure 2 is a bad policy. You should vote no against it. The primary reason is what Rick touched on, is it requires at least 2 campaigns in order to win a constitutional measure. You have to win at the primary and you have to win at the general. And he's right that out-of-state wealthy interests, they can go through those campaigns and no problem. And that's been part of my concern about Measure 4 as well, that if Measure 4 passes and Measure 2 passes, trying to change, make fine-tune adjustments to Measure 4 is going to be very, very difficult for the people of North Dakota. So I would say vote no on Measure 2 and Measure 4.
Well, just to be clear, Bob, it would make it hard for people, for initiated measure to do something different with Measure 4, right? The legislature, it doesn't, they still would be the, and frankly, if they were going to get rid of Measure 4 or do something different to it, it would most likely come from the legislature anyway. And so that process is not hampered by Measure 2. However, you and I are in full agreement. Measure 2 sucks.
Yep. Measure 2 sucks.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. That's probably a good place to end that part. So guys, we appreciate it so much. We'll do, I think we've said an awful lot, but if we've got some closing statements, you guys can go ahead and do that. Bob, why don't you go ahead and go first here and lead us on out, and then Rick will finish up with you.
All right. Well, like I said before, there's no Santa Claus here. There's no free ride. You're going to hear that Measure 4 is all about apple pie and motherhood and baseball, and it's full. It has a bunch of unknowns and creates a lot of risks for our state and our kids. We can do better. I've mentioned what I think is a better, more tailored solution that we'll have to work with the legislature to get it done. But I think because we are asking the state of North Dakota to take responsibility for spending decisions that are made at the local level, that we're asking the state of North Dakota to take that $3 billion responsibility that we're all responsible for. It's our responsibility. We elect those school board members, county commissioners, and so forth. We're asking the state of North Dakota to take that $3 billion and pay for it forever. And we have an economy that's reliant on oil industry. This is we can maybe get through it in a pinch for the first year or two, but long term, this puts, I think, our kids and our grandkids in jeopardy. This is not the panacea that the proponents suggest. We're in a high risk territory that we should stay out of. We don't need to go there. We can fix this thing with a scalpel as opposed to a sledgehammer.
All right. Well, we have in North Dakota a huge opportunity, and that is to give ourselves the property tax relief, the property tax reform that we were promised many years ago. The state has enough money. We know that they have a spending problem. They have had it for a long time, and there's no end in sight. So we can control that by forcing them to allow us to keep that money in our pockets, and it can be done. We know that Measure 4, despite what the opposition is saying, and I think with Bob and my debates, some of those concerns have been addressed. We know that the state must replace, without strings attached, every dollar that the locals are getting. We know that there's no loss of funding. These things are true. The gist of the argument is, do we have enough money to replace the current amount? There's so much other stuff, though, that people keep hearing about why you should vote no, loss of local control. That's not the case. So it comes down to, does the state have enough money? I think it has far more than enough money. What I would say is it's not going to happen if we don't make it happen. Nothing, the hope and plea for the legislators to do something already failed us. We can't rely on that. So we have this opportunity. Let's move forward. As far as the future, remember, it's a flat amount that the state replaces. Their revenue, their budget goes up every single year. So 10 years from now, it'll be far easier for the state to be replacing this current level of property tax than it is now even. Think back in 2012, if the same measure had been on the ballot and passed, the state would be looking at still replacing that amount, say $600 million. How easy would that be? So we can't forget that when we talk about, gosh, we can't do it in the future, the burden becomes less and less and less in the future. So we are actually doing something legacy for our future generations. It is sustainable. We have shown that. So please go out, talk to your friends and neighbors, vote yes on Measure 4, vote no on Measure 2. Thanks a lot for having us, Mike.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. Again, my thanks from the beginning. The work that you guys are putting into this is appreciated by the residents of our state and by me. So my personal thanks, and on behalf of our viewers and those that have seen this, thank you so much for being here. I'll put it back over to Jonathan to finish us up.
Well, I want to say a huge thank you to the debate participants and to Mike for hosting this. I think it was a fantastic debate, a lot of great discussion that's happened. Just want to say thank you to our viewers for tuning in and watching this. Thank you for your comments. A lot of great discussion down in the comment section. So really appreciate that. And just want to let you know that this is the only state debate that we're going to be doing. We'll be doing some local debates starting around October 15th. And we also have great conversations that are happening with people from all over the state. We have one with Senator Kevin Kramer that'll be coming out next week. And we have other great conversations that are happening. So make sure you subscribe to the Dakotan so that way you can be informed of other great content that will be coming your way. Thank you for watching this live debate, and have a great evening.